We do also, as I mentioned, see a number of different chromosome patterns. So not everybody's XX or XY. These are a few of the various other chromosome patterns that are possible, and they'll result in a number of different physical kinds of expressions. And most people assume that they know what their chromosomes are, by the way, but most of us haven't been tested. And so sometimes when I talk about an intersex condition, it's not always visible from the outside. Sometimes a child is born that looks typically male or typically female, but as they develop, an intersex condition will become apparent, or they may have internal organs that don't look like what you would expect from their external body. And none of us knows what our chromosomes are. There are people walking around who have divergent chromosome patterns and don't even know. So if you haven't been tested, you don't know. To give you a little bit more of a grip on this, I've put up some of the more common kinds of intersex conditions that you might see. For example, a person could be born with XY chromosomes, but have external genitals that look like completely typical female genitals. A person with that condition, which is called androgen insensitivity, won't have a uterus, and they'll have testes inside their body where most female people would have ovaries. So that's called androgen insensitivity syndrome, and in many cases, a person with that condition can go to puberty or older without ever being identified, and then sometimes those conditions are identified, and then that can result in problems. You can also have a person with XX chromosomes, but who has a uterus and ovaries, and genitals that can vary anywhere from looking like female genitals with maybe a slightly enlarged clitoris to looking like typical male genitals, or really anything in between. That condition is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Another possibility, this is a little more rare, but it's something that can happen, it's called ovotesticular DSD. A person can be born with one ovary and one testis, or two ovotestes that have both kinds of tissue. Often someone born in that situation will have a uterus. There's a number of different chromosome patterns that are possible, and often a person with this condition will have what's called ambiguous external genitals, which means, it's what I was talking about before, the doctors look at the baby when they're born, and this is what most people think about when they think about intersex. They look at the baby when they're born and they say, I don't know if that's a big penis or a really small penis or a really big clitoris. I don't know if I should call that opening a vagina, and I don't know whether this baby's a boy or a girl. So there's a number of these different conditions that can pop up. The take-home points from this part of my talk, in terms of how do you apply this in the immigration asylum context. First of all, that there is no single marker or test of sex, either medically or legally. So often what I hear is, well, can't you just do a chromosome test? No, you can't. And, I mean, you can, but it won't give you the answer. And there are, when doctors make gender assignments for children that are born intersex, according to the sort of the most extensive, latest consensus on how they do gender assignments, they'll look at the chromosome pattern, but they try to make the gender assignment on the basis of a prediction about the child's gender identity development. And so you'll have a lot of disagreement, and often a lot of uncertainty even now about what gender a child should be assigned. So the medical world doesn't agree that there's sort of one specific physical marker of sex, and that's the thing you can come down to. Similarly, there's no real legal definition in most contexts for sex. In American law, at least, I don't know of anywhere where there's a good legal definition of sex. And mostly it's one of those things we assume we know what we're talking about, right? We assume we know what it is when we see it. And that's because we assume that what we heard in sex ed was right. So the last take-home point then of that little section is something I say all the time to my audiences, which is, don't believe everything you think. And especially when you're dealing with an intersex case, don't believe everything you think, because so often what we have all been taught to think just isn't true. That nature is more diverse and more wonderful and more various than any of us have been taught to expect. And from that, I'm going to move on into a few stories of some of the cases I've seen to make it a little more concrete. Yeah?
No, there's a lot of unknowns about quantities because of what you stated. Is there any estimate at what percentage of the population may be intersex?
That is a great question. And there's no really good estimate. The most common estimate is about 1 in 2,000 live births. It varies a lot depending on how you define intersex, which of these various conditions you consider to be intersex, how ambiguous you think genitals have to be before you call them ambiguous. 2,000 is not a bad number. And I think we can fairly assume that intersex people are going to be overrepresented in any population that's persecuted. That's what we've seen everywhere we've looked for it. There hasn't been a lot of study done on this, but anywhere you look at situations where people are having a hard time, you're going to find the intersex population overly represented. I also actually, you reminded me, I wanted to make a quick point about gender as well. In the LGBT context, people often think about intersex as a flavor of transgender, or they think about intersex as an issue of gender. It's not necessarily that. Intersex is about a set of physical medical conditions, and intersex people have a variety of different gender expressions. And so that's really important to understand. For some intersex people, the gender they were assigned at birth fits. A lot of intersex people have very normative identities as male or female and don't experience themselves as gay, as queer, as part of the queer community, as transgender in any way. And yet they may face persecution because they have bodies that are not typical. Some intersex people do experience their gender assignment as wrong, and they may or may not, depending on where they're from and what kind of medical intervention they've had, they may or may not understand that as an intersex condition. So some intersex people may be telling a story that is a transgender story. Some intersex people have a gender identity that's more intermediate, or they're living a more mixed gender role. It can really, really vary. But it's not right to assume that there's a question of gender or that there's a struggle with gender identity or something like that. That is very often not the case.